Howdy, friends and neighbors. If you're wondering where our lesson is for last week, there wasn't one because I was attending a continuing education event. I learned many things at that event, but one of them is something that I want to talk about today because it ties in exactly with something from our Lenten devotion booklet, The Sanctuary for Lent. One of the things that they talked about at my conference was God's good creation, and particularly the creation accounts we find in our Bibles in the very beginning of the book of Genesis, in chapters 1 and 2. One of the things we talked about at the conference was what it means for humanity to be made in God's image. Now in Genesis 1:26 we read, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." Now, when God said that, it was on the sixth day of creation. God had already made the earth and the sea and the sky and the waters and the plants and the animals. God had already made everything else. And finally, God wanted to place some representative of the divine on earth. So next we read in Genesis 1:27 through 31, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, 'Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground.' Then God said, 'I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food.' And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day." What we find in this passage is that God made humanity in God's own image, and God gave humans the responsibility to be God's own ambassadors on earth, to care for the earth and to take care of things. One of the points that they emphasized at the conference I attended last week was that God specifically created people in God's image to be God's ambassadors, to be God's representatives here on earth. When they talked about this at the conference, it brought to my mind the passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where we read that we are Christ's ambassadors, that we who are Christians have a job and a role in God's kingdom to help bring people back to God. We do this by representing God as God's ambassadors. So, imagine my surprise then this week when I read the reading in our devotion for Lent at the top of the page for March 28th is 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 20, where it says, "We are ambassadors who represent Christ." And I thought, that's right. Not only are we who are Christians Christ's ambassadors, but the whole reason God put humans on earth is to be his ambassadors, to reflect his glory in the world. So then I just knew that I needed to look up exactly what the Greek word is that we translate ambassador. So I cracked open my Greek interlinear Bible, and right there, under the pink sticker, you can see the word presbenomen, which is a form of another word that we all know, which is presbyteros, which means elder, or presbyteroi, which means elders. We who are Presbyterian are called Presbyterian because we are ruled by our elders, that is, those who are mature in their faith. But this word, presbenomen, is very closely related. It's a very closely related root word, which means to be an ambassador. And we find this Greek word in a lot of the legal and official documents from ancient Greece, because when diplomats would travel to other countries as ambassadors, they used this exact same words in their documents to describe what they were doing, traveling to represent their country in another country, usually to negotiate peace and good relations between their countries. And that is exactly what 2 Corinthians 5:20 says that Christians are to do, to represent Christ and to negotiate peace between Christ and others so that they would be reconciled to God. We are to be diplomats, practicing diplomacy toward the world in an effort to help people better understand the love of God and to win people over to respond in love to the love of God. That has been our job from the very, very beginning, to bear God's image on earth, to reflect God's love in the world, to care for creation, and finally to be God's ambassadors on a peacemaking mission to reconcile people to God. In short, it is the Presbyterian way. If you want to know more, I encourage you to read 2 Corinthians chapter 5, or even the entire letter of 2 Corinthians. You can also go back and revisit the book of Genesis, especially chapter 1, and see how God's plan from the very beginning is still at work in us. God's purpose for humanity since the very beginning is still God's purpose for us in and through Jesus Christ. We are presbynomen for Christ. Thank you for listening, and thank you for reading your daily devotions. I hope you continue to find meaning and comfort and hope in these words each week. Have a great week.